That's right. I have music now. Welcome to episode 3 of the As Discussed podcast. In this episode, I've been joined by my friend James King of Mercer, a very seasoned, experienced advisor who, like me, for some reason is a sales compensation aficionado. So we got chatting about the role of sales compensation within the broader Salesforce effectiveness model, about the way that we tend to obsess over the compensation aspect, but really we should be thinking about other aspects of Salesforce effectiveness, such as quota setting and territory alignment, go-to-market strategy. But we also got into some of the details of sales compensation, how you build the plans, how you implement windfall provisions, and whether you should have caps and thresholds and the different types of mechanics out there. And we talked a lot about the role of the chief revenue officer, which was, I thought, particularly interesting, and how the chief revenue officer can navigate that relationship between the CEO and the sales function, how they can negotiate that quota and how they can balance top-down expectations with the realities of bottom-up sales opportunities. And finally, James cornered me and made me talk about my recent book, What Pay Costs. So if you are interested in hearing a bit about the process that led to that book, stick around until the end of our discussion. So without further ado, I give you episode 3 of As Discussed, featuring James M. King of Mercer. James King. Great to have you on the podcast. How are you doing?
Doing well. Yourself?
I'm doing very well. And what are we talking? We're here to talk about sales compensation, right? That's
I think so.
Sales compensation.
Yep.
Okay. So what do people get wrong about sales compensation? You see tons of this stuff, right? You work with a lot of clients. What is the most common mistake that people make?
You've heard me say this probably more times than you want to hear. So I've told people, this actually came from my buddy Sean, one of the smartest things he's ever said. Finance is about money, compensation is about motivation, right? And I think what a lot of people assume is that you can fix compensation by simply changing a mechanic or changing a number or something like that. And what they're kind of losing sight of is all the things that have to happen before the incentive plan is actually built, right? So, because an incentive plan, in my view, is really just a light switch or something that activates what's already in place. So you have your sales strategy, you have your structure that's built off that strategy, go-to-market strategy, all those things. And it's really just the incentives that activate everything that's already there. They don't really change it. And what they can do is they can expose it too. Symptoms can show up and you can say, okay, well, we probably need to look at, the way we're going or whatever it might be, right? So I think that's probably one of the things that I run into most often is actually convincing people that simply changing the number isn't going to fix the plan necessarily. Sometimes it could, yes, certainly. Like if you're saying you're going to change a metric because you have two roles, one role reporting another role, and they have conflicting metrics, your manager's going for profit and your direct seller's going for revenue, that could be an issue, right? You can make simpler changes like that. But more often than not, there's something underneath the incentives that you need to uncover before you can actually get to the design itself.
So people kind of rush to that plan, right? They look at is that just because it's there? Is that why? So I get the same thing all the time as well. Like people say, we need to fix our incentive plan. And they say people aren't cross-selling. There's confusion over market strategy. There's poor divisions of influence in the sales cycle, but we need to fix the incentive plan. But then they almost mention all the things that actually probably do need to be fixed and then say, but we need to fix the incentive plan. So is that just because it's there and they can fix it and it's easier to change?
I think that's part of it. I think the other thing is there's an assumption going on, an assumption that I will continue to fight against my entire career. And that is that sellers are coin operated. They're purely coin operated, right? I don't believe this for a second. I know too many sellers. If they're truly, and this is the example I give them, if someone is truly coin operated, that means the only thing they care about is the incentive, which the logic follows. It's just the incentive. It's just a matter of making incentive large enough to be able to get them to do what you want to do, which you and I both know is kind of a non sequitur. That doesn't really make sense. So simple example, if I say, James, I need you to jump, 1,000 yards in any direction and I'll give you $100. And you look at me and say, James, I can't do that. And I say, okay, well, what if I make it $1,000? Well, what if I make it $1 billion? Okay. You might try to find some clever way to get around it, right? But that's not going to change your ability to actually do what I'm asking you to do just by making the incentive larger, right? Sellers can tell when things look off. You're telling me you want me to go sell this amount in this market? with no changes to product market fit or anything else, they know better. And one of two things is going to happen. They're either going to stop trying and maybe go somewhere else, or they're going to try to hit the number, but maybe not in the way you want them to hit the number. And I don't mean necessarily like a Wells Fargo example or anything like that, but just they might be trying to find other clever ways around the plan. This is what we call gaming the plan, to try to still hit the number for you, because that's the focus. It's that metric. The metric is the target, right? And that can often become a really big issue.
Yeah, yeah. I completely agree, by the way. This myth that salespeople are coin operated, it's just not true. If you've ever seen a sales environment, I always like to say, like, the sales team is more like a sports team than anything else. There's a huge amount of game theory and a huge amount of the joy of the sale is the sport as much as the financial reward at the end of it. Like, they love the idea of winning and closing and celebrating those deals. And I think that often gets overlooked as well, the psychology of sales and how much that motivates people.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah. So one of the reasons why I focus on sales comp is because I find it the most interesting.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, I can do broad-based. I've done executive, worked on industry side, done proxies, all that stuff, right? But in sales, you really get into two things that are fascinating to me. One, human behavior, which I think is really, really interesting, right?
Yeah.
And the other thing is something that you can directly measure success on. It's so hard in like corporate AI, annual incentive plans, annual company bonus plans and stuff like that to match performance to actual output and then, it helping the company, right? And we still try to do it. We try to find a way to mash it up with KPIs and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
But in sales, it's much cleaner and it's much easier to say, yes, your effort was amazing. You're going to get paid really, really well, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I love that cleanliness because I think there are so few places in business where you have that. I won't call it a one-to-one relationship because I don't think it's that clean all the time, but you have that closeness in performance and payout, right? Pay for performance is its own bag of cats, but I think in sales is where you can get the closest to it, right? As opposed
That's
to
interesting.
other areas.
And I agree. And one thing I wanted to ask about actually is how much does that clean link still apply in modern sales? So, and the context for this is, you can probably see where I'm going with this. Like, in the old days, sales was knocking on doors and selling something and moving on to the next house. And then it became, over the phone or in person. And even when he had software, they were still selling a disc and they would use that disc until another disc came along. You'd sell that new disc. But in the world of SaaS and the lifetime value of the customer and the way Salesforce reinvented sales with the customer success model and focused on retention and reducing churn, does that logic still hold with sales roles?
Does it hold? I think it does. Does it hold to the same extent? Probably not. And that's not even mentioning indirect channels, right? Going through distributors, not being able to get the data and stuff like that. So I think but I also think that's part of the fascination that I have with it too, is it's not always that clean. Like the clean ones aren't the ones you spend a lot of time on and tell war stories with your buddies about, right? It's not the easy projects or the easy problems that you solve. Like, yes, you definitely need to solve those and you definitely need help, but it's the ones that are more complex where you don't have that clean link. So do I think it holds? Yeah, I still think it holds to some extent. Cause if it didn't, then you kind of go down the path of, well, do incentives work at all? I think they do. Do they work to the same extent? Is it easy to measure them as it was before? No, I don't think it is. But I do still think there's a link.
Yes, yeah. And that's the challenge, isn't it? Like knowing that incentives can do something, knowing that people respond to those incentives, and you can get, through studies, we know this, we can get higher volume by introducing incentive-based pay, but recognizing the complexity of the modern sales cycle. So I think a really good example, consumption-based sales, for example, this feels like the direction a lot of things are heading. SaaS was 10 years ago, 20 years ago, maybe. And now we're seeing a lot more consumption-based sales. How do you, in a consumption-based world, again, like for those that might be unfamiliar with it, this is where the customer kind of decides how much they want to use the product. You don't really know what you're selling when you sell it. How do you design sales incentives in that kind of uncertainty?
So that's kind of usage-based or consumption-based model is more popular now. Before they had cost plus pricing, right? Pretty straightforward. You got cost, add your margin on. And now you're getting into outcome-based or even dynamic pricing like you have in airlines that some people in other industries are actually tinkering with a little bit, which is, you want to talk about a problem, that could really change the game. But to get back to your question about consumption based, so I've seen 4 or 5 different ways that people have attempted consumption based pricing. I think usually what it comes down to, you're either breaking up payments. So you're still trying to reward the person, but you're also trying to cover in case things don't work out. Right. I've also seen actual thresholds put in on customers that they have to use X amount. And so that seller will get paid a certain amount up to that threshold. But then beyond that, they'll actually get an accelerator because now the customer is actually using more than the contract requires. I've seen people split up payments. Oftentimes what you'll see some kind of arrangement where there'll be an initial payout and then there'll be some kind of true up, right? There'll be some kind of estimated number or guess based upon historicals or whatever it might be. They'll get a payment based on that. And then you get a true up later. Usually it's an underpayment because they don't have to claw stuff back. If they are going to claw stuff back, usually I try to steer them away from that. And what I tell them is, instead of clawing something back, bake it into the percentage, right? Just figure out what your conversion rate is and bake it into the percentage itself. So I think there are a few different ways, but again, to your point earlier, is that link as clean as it used to be? And I think the answer is no. And consumption-based pricing is a great example of that. Look at all the ways we got to twist and turn ourselves to actually find a way to reward the behavior. It's going to continue to be challenging.
Well, and that's the question is there any evidence that once you've done all those twists and turns, that people are still being motivated by this plan that you're doing? Because there is research around sales incentives to show that they do work. And the famous one is by Atlassian with SafeLight, the windshield installation company. But that's very transactional. It was a piece rate, simple dollar-based commission plan, and he did manage to increase output, and he attracted more people that also increased that output. However, there is really no research beyond basic commissions to show that those forms of incentive drive increased sales performance. So I don't know. I would love to see some research, like an actual research in a consumption-based sales organization, like a with incentive and without incentive model, to see if there is actual tangible data to show that once you take all those ifs and buts into account, that it's still driving something.
Yeah, I was going to say, and I don't know if it's too new to have this decision. I don't think so. It's a great question as to why we don't have something more formalized like that. But okay, so I'm going to steer the conversation a little bit. So I'm really curious. So consumption-based pricing, usually you hear that in, specifically in the technology space, specifically the SaaS space. And I've found, working in the sales compensation area, there's a strong tendency to talk specifically about technology with sales compensation. If you go to the sales conference, it's dominated by SPMs and all this stuff. And so I think I'm really curious to know why, because I know that's not where I grew out of. They grew out of the principles of exec comp, actually, which is actually really interesting that the technology's kind of taken a foothold in it. And I don't know if it's because, and I promise I'll get back to the consumption-based piece. I don't know if it's because, my suspicion is because that technology is a way that we try to trap uncertainty, right? And so I think with something that has less of that clean link that we were talking about before, I think it's our best attempt at trying to house that, trying to capture that, try to understand that. But
I love that quote.
Why
by the
don't
way.
we have?
Was it technology is how we trap uncertainty? Was that your
Trap
exact words?
uncertainty? Yeah, I think that's how we try to
uncertainty.
we try to trap uncertainty sometimes. In the same way you get what was the phrase you used? Cognitive closure. Right?
I was actually just thinking of that.
Because
we
like
love
numbers.
We love to see tangible examples that what we're doing is doing the thing that we say we're doing, and it makes us feel more secure in our jobs, right? When we can show, hey, look, I've done this. There's a number to prove it, regardless of whether that number is actually useful or not.
I was going to say, even if it's not correct, right? Even if it's based upon a mountain of assumptions, which is actually one of the exercises I walk through some of my clients with is to show them the assumptions that are being made by the plan that they have, right? Not the plan I made them, but the plan they have. So if you have this plan, here are some of the assumptions you have about your seller, about your role, about your talent that you're trying to bring, like all these things. And that's when I go back to my professor days, that sometimes I'll get the light bulb, right? Like, oh, wow. Right. And that, I think, that's probably one of the best that's probably one of the best parts about working in sales comp is seeing that, oh, we are doing that. Okay. We don't have it stated. We don't have it in a policy. It's an implied activity that we're doing. It's an implied message we're sending, right?
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
So I think that's, sorry, a bit of a money trail, but I think that's one of the pieces that's really, really cool about working in sales comp.
Yeah, it is. Like I think you said it earlier, it's kind of this intersection of human behavior, human psychology, and capitalism, basically. So it's a real direct link. Yeah. So when we started, you mentioned that we both agree that when you hear there's a sales compensation plan problem, it usually isn't, or it maybe is, but there's a whole bunch of other stuff. What are the other things? You mentioned a few things quickly. There's GTM and strategy and indirect channels and things like that. What are some of the other areas within this broad discipline of Salesforce effectiveness then companies need to spend maybe more time thinking about?
Well, in most companies, so customer segmentations, well, let me back up. So business objectives, like what the overall company is trying to do, should always be directly tied to your sales strategy. That's bottom line, right? If those are misaligned, nothing else is going to work.
And by the way, I'm just going to interrupt you briefly because you make that sound so simple, but the amount of companies I work with, especially high growth ones, and I say, okay, what is the key strategic objective here? And they say, well, we want to do this, but we also want to do that, but we want to grow revenue, but also we want to keep our customers happy, but also want users on the platform. We don't want to charge them too much. So how could you possibly expect anyone to understand the battle they're fighting if you can't just explain it to them in a single sentence? So sorry to interrupt you, but that first one is so important. Can you take a business strategy and give people sales objectives?
It's an excellent point because so many people want to do all the things, right? So if you're doing all the things, you're probably doing nothing well. Right. That's which is really, it's hard to hear, but I mean, talking to clients about this, like, give me your top 2 things that you want to do. And okay, those are your metrics. Like I've had that conversation at least a dozen times. Right. So that's a great point. Your business objectives, your key business objectives, being tied directly to your sales strategy. Right. So you have to be able to take those objectives and make them something real in sales. Right. Whatever that might be. And there are different ways we can dig into that if we want to, but there are different ways to conceptualize that. So I'd say definitely tying those 2 things together. And then you start your sales strategy with understanding what your customers are, right? Your customer segmentation. You can do this through, ICPs, ideal customer profiles, and then building segmentation from there. You can use CRM data if you got it, ERP data, subscription data, whatever it is. And you can figure out you start seeing the data cluster, what those segmentations look like. I've even done it through interviews. I've even put together segmentation models just through pure interviews and understanding what the jobs are doing. So I say that the next key piece there is customer segmentation. I will say most clients actually have a pretty good idea of what that is because they're selling to people, and honestly, if they didn't have it right, they probably wouldn't have any customers. Now, could they be modified? Could they be adjusted? Could they have different roles and be more effective? Sure, they could be a little more efficient in certain areas. But generally speaking, most of my clients have a good sense of who their customers are.
And that's what customer segmentation is, right? So it's really just who are we selling to? So So when we think of customer segments, we think like mid-market, small companies, large enterprise, that kind of thing, right?
It's taking the this is not me. It's taking the chaos that is the customer ecosystem and boiling down into something that makes sense for us as an organization, right? It's a way to understand the customer chaos in a way that we can attack it, right? We can take action on it, right? And so I'd say that's foundational. You have to understand your customer segmentation before really anything else can happen, right? You have to know who you're going after. And so I'd say usually you also want to understand, these aren't necessarily in a specific order, but you want to understand the sales process. You want to understand your product market fit. I had one client where we talked quite a bit about one of their sales plans. And at the end of the day, they reached a conclusion without me because I was kind of trying to lead them. And I was asking them, well, tell me about the product a little bit more. And they're like, I don't think we have a good product market fit. I was like, might be onto something there. That's absolutely right. Right.
Good Socratic reasoning, Matt. Just keep asking questions until they give you the answer that you want them to find.
Well, I honestly wasn't sure how they felt because this was kind of their baby. So I didn't want to, call their baby ugly. Right. And let them arrive at the conclusion because I also wasn't sure if that was it. And once they took the leap, And I was like, okay, then I think we're onto something here. So sales roles, org design's another big one. A sales process, I can't remember how I said that. So there's a few different things that you're going to be looking at before you really start talking about territories and deployment. You're really going to be talking about these pieces before you need to consider the incentives. Because the
Yeah, so
incentives are really, again, just an enablement of the other stuff.
they're like the last piece, right? Like that's the last thing you do is, and if you've done all that
Supposed
stuff
to be.
right, so if you've got your strategy right, you know what your sellers are supposed to be selling, you know who they're selling to, you know which types of sellers you're going to recruit to do that, then you give them goals. Then it should be very easy to assign
Should be pretty straightforward.
quotas, right?
Yep.
So it's kind of like
Yep.
building the shape of the sales team first, and then the incentives kind of comes after that, right?
Yeah.
What about quota setting?
Gosh.
So now we've got to the point, we've got a strategy, we've got our territories, we've divvied up into areas of the world, and we've got our products that we know we're selling to each people. But now you actually have to figure out how to assign someone a target. Well, I guess first we should say not necessarily, right? You don't have to have quotas. You could just give people a commission rate and the compensation cost of sale model.
Yeah, you could. So quotas are by survey data, actually from AGI. The most difficult thing for organizations to do for the last 2.5 decades, with one exception. The most difficult thing last year was the uncertainty in the market. It's the first year they didn't have quotas, which makes sense. And I think this year it's going to go back. This year,
it's kind of the same thing as well. The uncertainty of the market.
I was going to say it's kind of is double speak, but yeah, quotas are easily one of the hardest things to help companies accomplish. And if you can crack the quota code, then everyone's going to be really, really happy. Most of the advice that I give people on quotas is it needs to be grounded in data and conversations. I mean, that's what I believe in all of these things, right? It doesn't matter what you're looking at, whether it's sales process, segmentation, or quotas, but you need to be looking at as much data as you can, and must take it back, as much good data as you can, because more data is not necessarily better data. And you need to be having conversations with the actual sellers themselves. I don't ever believe numbers should give you an answer. Numbers should give you a question. Okay. Why is it that number? If someone's knocking that out of the park, congratulations, wonderful. Why are they knocking it out of the park? Are they knocking it out of the park because they're a good seller? Are they knocking it out of the park because they're a lucky seller? Because they got the territory that everybody wants, or they got a house account that, they really don't have to manage it, but it goes to their quota, right? Like whatever it might be. So I'd say when it comes to quotas, the really important thing is to, first of all, looking at all your historicals and understanding what good data and bad data is and using that, but then also being able to take a top down and a bottom up approach, right? Like ideally you have finance and everyone else running the numbers going, okay, what do we need to be healthy? And then you have sales going, okay, what can I get out of these accounts this year? What new accounts can I get? And doing some forecasting, which is never precise. And then meeting in the middle. I mean, the best organizations that I've seen do quota setting are the ones who really coordinate that top down and bottom up approach and say, okay, finance really wants, 10% growth. Sales is saying we can give them 2. Okay, what can we realistically do? Okay, if we want to get to 7, what do we need to do now to adjust this? Do I need to hire another seller? Do I need stuff like that, right?
Yeah,
so I'd say it's a process. I think a lot of organizations are aware of how difficult it is because they go through the struggles every year. And I would also allow yourself some flexibility in your plans for the quotas to not, if the quotas are
a restatement,
not set correctly. Yeah. And I wouldn't say you got to be careful with that, because you don't want sellers to think you're taking money away from them succeeding. Right. So you have to be very careful with those kinds of pieces. But what I would say is, obviously there's a really large event that happens. You need to have something in the contract that you have the seller sign, which I always recommend they do. It says, look, if you have something big happen, good or bad, the company's going to review it. Right. We're going to review it, anything. And I usually say put amounts in there. So like be as specific as you can, because quota setting is never going to be perfect. I've yet to meet an organization that has quota setting perfect.
I want to come back to one point you made there about big, unusual deals, how we deal with that. So I've got a few specific questions that I want to ask you about in a minute.
Sure.
But before we do that, and we talk about quota setting, it is interesting the point you're making, because it's kind of a healthy tension, isn't it? Because you've got a tension from the top where you might have some, especially in startups and tech, where CEOs, oh, I want $1 billion this year. I want to double it next year. It's like, what's that based on? Like, what makes you think that's even achievable? Okay, but that's the number you want. So it's our job to try and figure out how to do it. But then what I find is that then you've got the bottoms up approach. So the top down approach is when the CEO gives you a number. The bottoms up approach is when you figure out what you can actually sell. And what I think is the best CROs or the sales leaders are really good at navigating that, because that's their job.
Yes.
A lot of them are ex-sellers, but you don't really need to be a good seller. You need to be a good politician at this point if you're a CRO. So how does a good CRO navigate that tension? Like, what are some of the tools they can use to take a ludicrous number and find a way to hit it, or show that you can't hit it? Like, is it a case of saying, look, I can do it, but there's a whole bunch of stuff you're going to have to give me if we're going to try and hit that number? Like, is that part of the conversation?
Yeah, it's a negotiation. I mean, it depends on what path they want to go down. So if they're going to say, okay, I'll give you that exact number, and you're going to give me 10 more headcount, so I can divide up this territory, so I can go deeper into these accounts and get more market share, right? Like so CRO doesn't have to be an ex-seller, but they've got to know how it works. They've got to know the language, and they've got to know the struggles that the frontliners go through too. I like it. I don't think your best seller is necessarily your best candidate for manager. I don't believe that at all. But oftentimes they're not one of the best candidates. But they do have to know how the sausage is made, right? They have to know what it's like to be on the road and carry the bag and missing quota and all that stuff, because they got to be able to understand the sales team. They got to understand how it's going to impact them, because that's why compensation is about motivation, because it involves people, right? So they've got to understand it's not just a number that he's getting from the CEO or CFO, right? He or she's getting from the CEO or CFO. It is something that says, okay, you're going to have to put in extra time, sellers. Like this has meaning to them, right? That number has meaning to them. And so what I think he has to be able to do, or she has to be able to do, is take that number and say, okay, here's either what I'm going to get in return, and be able to prove that out, why it's going to do it, or say, okay, this number is really not realistic. And again, be able to prove it out. Talk to the team, talk to them, and figure out what they think is realistic and why. And then essentially you're making a business case. And the best CROs that I've met are the ones who make the business case like it's not a question. They say, this is the state of affairs. This is the way things are. If you proceed to ask for this number, you will lose this much in headcount. Right. We will lose people because these quotas are too high. Right. And they don't shy away from it. So the best CROs are the ones that I've seen do that really, really well.
Yeah. Yeah. And conversely, the worst ones tend to just take the number and go, oh, just fine. And then they'll go to the sales team and say, this is the number. And the sales team go, what? And they go, yeah, I know. Right, but this is what it is. And then all of a sudden, you've lost all your authority as a sales leader. You've lost all the inspiration possible for the sales team. You're about to spend a year with an unmotivated sales team that know they can't achieve the objectives you've got to give them. And you've just broken down the relationship between the entire sales function and the organization.
And your CRO's got to be a fighter to some extent. Your CRO, and I say this true for a
respectful fighter.
Yeah, respectful. Yeah, of course, respectful. Yeah, I mean, someone who can really go to bat for the team, right? Because that's what you're doing. You're not just there you're not a messenger. You're not someone just grab the number and then pass it on to everyone else. If you are, you're a completely ineffective CRO, right? Sorry, you might want to edit that out, but you are if you're just taking number and going. And again, nothing on CROs with that. It could be the culture. Like if the sales group doesn't really have any influence in the culture itself, because they haven't had leadership before, or they have a new CRO in, and I've seen this in organizations before where the highest level they had in the sales org was a VP, and they didn't really have any senior representation, right? So they bring in a new CRO, and that person's still kind of trying to figure things out. So the first or second year, they're kind of taking the number and shoving it down. Not really on them. They're still trying to feel things out. So I do think you got to consider the circumstances, but again, you got to be a bit of a fighter if you want.
And it might, and you mentioned like it might mean headcount, but also it might mean being even more creative, like indirect sales channels. You mentioned that earlier. It might be about saying, well, look, we can get that number, but we're going to have to recruit a distributor for APAC. We're going to have to create a new market. It's going to happen at a much lower margin. We're not going to see the same margins that you enjoyed in the US or your home country. It might involve hiring a regional sales lead, which is, as we all know, a bit of a mixed bag because it's more difficult to recruit in unfamiliar territories. So, there are so many areas as a CRO that you can bring into that negotiation And I think if any sales leader or aspiring sales leader is listening, this is the stuff you need to learn about to go from being a
Yes.
seller to a sales leader. It's the strategy and the politics around growth.
Yeah. You can bring, and I encourage people to bring disagreement, but anytime you bring disagreement, bring solutions.
Mm.
Don't just bring problems. But it's easy to find problems, right? It's very easy. It's
Bring me
much,
a
much
solution,
harder
not a
to
problem.
develop
Yeah, I think
solutions.
that's
Yeah.
one of the early things I was taught as a young accountant is bring me a solution, not a problem.
Yeah. Yeah. And so some of the most valuable people that I work with, I get to work alongside, the ones who stand out automatically are the ones who bring you solutions. They'll point something out and they'll say, here's what I think we should do. And then we have a conversation. And I would say it's the exact same with the CROs too.
Yeah. So you mentioned something earlier, which brings you on to the next section, because there are a lot of problems that just seem to come up all the time with sales plans, and you probably hear these same ones a lot. So I wanted to get your thoughts on a few key things. And as you've mentioned one already, let's start with that. Big deals. When you have those giant deals that the plan was never really designed for, but someone brought it in, so technically they earn the commission. How do you solve for that without putting caps in place? Because this is very related to the concept of a cap as well. So in fact, this is two questions in one. I'm going to rephrase my question.
Okay.
Should you have caps and plans, and how do you deal with big deals?
So first thing I'd say is distinguish between hard caps and soft caps. So hard caps mean you cannot earn, just for the audience, in case we don't know, hard cap is mean you cannot earn above X amount, right? It doesn't matter what you do, you're not going to earn above this, right? There's only one time I've ever recommended a hard cap across all of my clients. I do not like hard caps. I think they're on the face and in reality very demotivating to the sales force, which is the last thing you want to be doing to your sales force. The only time I've ever recommended it is when they were capacity constrained, right? So they could simply not keep up with the manufacturing. The manufacturing could keep up with the sellers, right? And so the reason why I told them, I said a hard cap, it's pretty high, but the hard cap is there is because you run the risk of ticking off your clients and not being able to deliver what you promised, which can ruin your relationships in the long term. So I think it's a better position for you to put that hard cap there than run risk of losing your clients who you've had for 15 or 20 years, right? So I'm not a huge fan of hard caps, but there are very, very narrow situations in which I can see an argument for them. Soft caps are usually things like deal size caps. So you can't earn any more than X amount on a certain deal, or even some people would consider decelerators on the commission rate as a sort of cap. Yeah, right. Because you're not earning at the same rate. So I can see those. I can see the soft caps in certain circumstances, but usually what I recommend, regardless of caps, is there needs to be a clause in your plan that says you're going to review bluebird or mega deals or whatever, right? If it is a deal that is classified as outside of the norm, and you can put parameters around that, or you can just say norm is at the discretion of management, however you want to do it. I prefer if they actually outline it because I usually make sellers feel a bit better.
If possible, let's put some guardrails. A number's better than no number. As soon as you introduce that discretionary component, if someone actually reads it, they're like, okay, what does that mean?
Yeah.
Like, is it worth closing this deal, or is this going to,
Yeah, exactly. And how are you going to take my money from me, right?
Right.
And it depends on what kind of trust you have in the organization, right? There's one organization I worked with, the trust level was very, very low because of past actions that had happened, and they were working on it, and they had to detail everything because they didn't have the trust yet. I've had other organizations where, especially organizations that are like ESOPs and things like that, where everybody's kind of, I hate saying they're not family, but everyone just knows everyone, and they're like, yeah, that sounds reasonable, right? And everyone can do it with a handshake. So I would say the language is dependent upon your culture, but definitely something in there that says we recognize these are unique situations, so we're going to treat them as unique situations effectively, right? I actually have a client right now who I'll just say they're in manufacturing, and they have these specific events that happen. And they're essentially the companies that they manufacture for. They have these events every few years, and it's just whatever seller happens to get it, right? There's no work in trying to get it, right? And it's huge. It's a huge order. And so I told them, I was like, well, what do we do about these? I was like, well, what have you done so far? And they're like, we just pay whoever it comes into. I was like, okay, maybe not that, because they're really not working for,
it's just luck.
Yeah, it's just luck.
Yeah.
Whoever picks up the phone effectively, right? And so I said, the first thing you need is you need to put a clause in your contract that says, and you can even name this event. You can name that event specifically to let them know what problem you're trying to solve, right? So I would say, above all else, make sure you have some of that clause in there that gives you the flexibility to look at these exceptions, because they are exceptions, right? If something lands in your lap, right, you're not expecting it, it may be great. But the other thing is you actually need to investigate it. Because it is not fair to a seller who's been working for 2 years on a deal to finally get this giant deal. And then you go, well, we're going to review this, right? We're not sure if we're going to pay on it. And that's why that clause is in there, is to protect both of you, right? But you actually need to do an investigation. Like, okay, where was the effort? How long they've been talking to him? And I've seen that happen too before, where they've had a large deal land because it just so happened to land all at once. Initially, the deal started out small, but then the seller kept working on the potential prospect, was able to upsell them on a few other items they needed, and it turned into a pretty big deal. And they said, well, let's review this. And I said, well, you need to make sure you need to pay the seller. Like they are the reason this number came in. That's really what that clause is there for. If it's luck or if it's skill, right? In this case, it was skill, right? Like you need to pay the seller in that case. So.
Yeah. You mentioned a phrase that I think was, they're just trying to figure out how not to pay me, or they're trying to figure out how to take my money away. The amount of times I've heard sellers say things of that nature, like they're just trying to figure out every time you change the plan, they're just trying to figure out a new way not to pay us. It's amazing how often you get that reaction. The first thing I think is, wow, how little trust do you have with your sales team if that's their immediate reaction to any change?
Yeah.
And it's things like that, like it's those exceptions. And it frustrates me because those are the stories that are just the best to retell across a sales org. If you've got a story about one seller that killed it for the company and themselves, you can retell that story. You can recycle that story for several years thereafter as an incentive for people to keep working, keep looking at those opportunities. Don't dismiss something because it looks small at the outset, because if you know what you're doing, well, that person was able to turn a tiny deal into a deal that basically reshaped our business for the next year.
That's actually I'm so glad you said that. That's actually the follow-up advice I give him is, if you do have a big deal land, you better, President's Club or whatever you like, advertise this, show everyone,
celebrate,
look how great, celebrate with them, right? Make this a great thing. And don't make it a negative. So it goes back to a deeper question about, how do you view not just your sellers, but your people? Are they a cost, or are they an asset? And I think this applies specifically to sales as well too, right? Do you see them as a cost or an asset? Well, they bring in revenue. Yeah, I know they bring in revenue, but how are you treating them, right? Are you treating them about a cost to be contained or an asset to be utilized? And I think that really can help determine some of your philosophy going forward, and even some of your incentive designs and things like that. I would encourage people to treat them like assets. I can understand in some circumstances why you might try to do cost containment, whether the business hasn't grown over the last few years and you're trying to research, whatever it is, right? Like, I get it. There are certain circumstances, but if you view your sellers and your people in general as an asset, to be cultivated, to be grown, then I think you position yourself in a much better place to succeed generally as an organization, in sales and business.
That's the philosophy, isn't it? I'm sure you do the same thing. You've got to start out with some basic principles about what we're trying to do with these things. And that's a great philosophical start point here. These are assets that can grow our business. If we think about it that way, it's going to completely redefine how we think about the incentives. Because one thing I'm curious as to whether you use this as well, so much of the plan design is designing for bad scenarios. Like, so much of it's designed out of fear. And it's designed for, but what if someone doesn't do this? What if someone can't do that? What if we've got a low performer? What if they're not? What if they just put their feet up? But then get rid of them, or put them on a PIP, or train them up, or reskill them, or put them in a different role. But you've got a way bigger problem at your hands than someone earning a bit of commission if they're just not penetrating a territory. Start worrying about your amazing performers, because that's what you want to attract, right? We all said we want the best talent, but you're designing a plan to guard against bad talent. So which one is it?
Yeah. Lowest common denominator plans. Yeah. I think part of that goes back to the kind of relationship that sales has with finance, right? Usually finance is one who's watching the numbers, right? They're finance and accounting, right? They're watching the numbers, but I think that's where sales needs to have that conversation with them. Like, look, you actually want to grow and not just protect. Then we have to have plans that get people excited about growing, right? Again, it's a philosophical issue. It's plans just quantify it for you. right? Make people feel a little bit better about it. But really, at bottom, if you want to grow, then you have to have a plan that allows for growth. And that
Yeah.
means you take risks, right? You're going to have to take risks on this. And like you said, like that cracks me up. It's so funny you said that. People are like, well, what if they just put their feet up? What if I have not met too many lazy sellers, honestly. I really have. If you're in sales, lazy is usually not the word used to
Right.
describe you. So my question would be, why are they struggling? Are they not picking up the phone? Are they like, that would be my question. I don't automatically assume they're lazy. I assume there's something going on, right? But yeah, I mean, if you do have a lazy seller or whatever it is, then yeah, you would manage them out.
Right.
It doesn't,
Well, ask
you don't
yourselves
change the
why
plan.
they're lazy. How is it that
Yeah.
you brought a seller in? No one wants to be lazy. This is just the thing I come back to again and again. People are not naturally lazy. No one is. Very few people join a company and go, I'm going to put my feet up. Everyone joins a company excited about the prospect. It takes something to make them lazy. So if someone's lazy, I'm
Yeah.
like, okay, what have you done here? Because that's a human being. Human beings are not people that are naturally lazy. They're doing something with their time. So why is it they don't want to do sales with their time? And what have you done to that person? Not, can we figure out a way not to pay them their commission for the next quarter?
Yeah. I think people want to be engaged. I think people naturally want to be engaged, and it takes, I don't know if I say it takes effort, maybe even a lack of effort to be disengaged,
Mm,
right? Like over time, right? You can become disengaged. And so it takes effort to continue to be engaged, but I think people naturally tend to, or want to be interested in what they're doing, want to be around interesting people, want that intellectual stimulation, right? Like I think
yeah,
they
yeah.
want that more than anything. Like you're in sales, you want a challenge, right? If you've chosen to put your paycheck on whether or not you succeed, you are probably a bit of an adrenaline junkie, and you want a challenge, right? And I admire. I mean, this is one thing I tell people. I tell a lot of my clients is I admire sellers, right?
Yeah.
It's a
Mhm.
hard job. It's a really hard job, especially if you're doing outbound. Oh my goodness. I mean, outbound sellers, hats off to you, man. Like those people
I wouldn't do
are,
it.
oh no, like really, like it is a hard job. So when people tell me, well, I just think they're lazy, or they just need to sell more. That one, that one kills me. I'm like,
You just need
okay,
to sell more.
they just need to sell more. Okay, are you going to tell them how? Like, this is, you got to coach them. You got to give them some direction, because they are probably trying to sell as much as they possibly can. You got them on a commission plan. Like, trust me, they're trying to sell more. So there's something else, and this gets back to, okay, what about your segmentation, product market fit? What's your sales process? You got the right roles, right? Like it gets, do you have the right people on the right roles, right? Like some people, like you and I can never be outbound sellers, right? You put me in an outbound role, I'm not going to be successful. It's not my personality. My skin's not that thick, right? I get enough people saying no to me, I want to start crying probably. So it's just not a good fit for us. But I think whenever people tell me they just need to sell more, my immediate response is how? How do you want them to sell more? Right.
And
And if
the
you
other
know
one
how,
is,
tell them.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, true. Yeah, exactly. And that's where sales leadership comes in again. I think sales leadership is
exactly.
one of the most
Exactly.
overlooked, probably just is the most overlooked aspect of engaging in a sales force. There's
That's right.
one thing I wanted to come back to, the relationship between finance and sales, particularly as it relates to the end of your sales compensation design cycle. So we've gone through a few things around the market, around the role segmentation. We've talked a bit about plan design. We'll come back to a few things around that as well. But now you've got these plans. And to your point, the reaction from finance is, wow, that's expensive. Or can we pay them
Yeah.
less? Like, can we improve our margins? So what are some of the ways, and a lot of the time, by the way, I think you probably find this as well, that by the time you've got to the end of that sales cycle, you've got no time left. You just got to get quotas out and send these plans out. But ideally, there should be some time allowed for financial modeling and
Yeah.
reconciliation and dialogue with your finance leaders,
Yeah.
or if not
Ideally.
from the beginning of the process, if possible, right? If everyone's got enough time. But what are some of the ways that let's say you're a sales plan practitioner or sales compensation professional, what are some of the ways that you can help get that plan over the line from a financial perspective?
Finance is involved from the beginning is usually the easiest way to do it. And honestly, the way I recommend. Nobody gets a surprise at the end of the process, right? Everybody's along the way. So that's at least finance, sales, and HR, or at least the groups involved. depending on the group, depending on culture, maybe operations as well, maybe IT, but it depends. But at least those three groups from the beginning are involved. So the hope is that as you're designing, you can go either right into cost modeling, or you can start modeling some plans that you've already got. You don't have to wait for everything to be done and then move on to the next stage, right? So the most successful groups I've seen, that is the groups most closely releasing their plans to when they say they're going to, they're bringing finance along with them, right? So I actually have a client right now, excellent client, really, they know what they're doing. Not just from a business standpoint, but from a team and leadership standpoint. And from the very beginning, from the first meeting I had with them, when they were trying to figure out if they wanted to work with me, finance, sales, and HR were all in the same room, all interviewing me, all asking me questions, right? And they've been together all the way through. And it has worked great, because if someone has a question, we got the person we need. They're right there. So the best way to do it is to have representation throughout the entire process. Now, that gets trickier with bigger organizations, because it depends on how much sign off and approval and stuff like that you need. So then you start talking about, okay, we're going to have, representatives of these groups in these meetings, and then we're going to have what I'll call like a sign off meeting, every month or 2 weeks or whatever the cadence needs to be, right? To actually get it in front of, we'll say, the decision makers and say, okay, are you okay with this?
Yeah, so the governance structure is almost like you might have a design team of sort of mid-level people that have enough information to guide you and guide everyone else. But they'll say, well, I don't know about this. Really, the CFO needs to sign off on this one. Then you've got almost like executive steering committee above
like
them
a steering committee
that you're never going to get all that time from, but they can break the tie or decide on things that the rest of the okay.
And I've even had one instance where the steering committee said, we don't need a meeting. Just send us the material, list out the decisions you want, and we'll get back to you.
Well, I was about to say it. If they trust the stakeholders, it tells you a lot about the organization culture. We know so many organizations that will say that, but when push comes to shove, they go, no, don't agree with any of this. We need to get on the phone to discuss this. It's like, well, why did you bother empowering someone to make those decisions if you were just going to override them? So many organizations fail because of a lack of this ability to push work down and trust people to make decisions. But you learn a lot about a company when you see that relationship and how effectively it operates, I think.
Yeah, and it works. And it was very effective. It was incredibly effective, because the design team and us could just keep cranking through it. And then we got to a point where, like, okay, this is a decision point. We'd send our materials, we'd send, the questions we had and provide any context, and they would get back to us usually within like 3 to 5 days. And so we could just keep the project moving. We could work on other stuff while they were making a decision on that stuff. So it was great.
It's so important, isn't it? The word governance is probably the most boring word in the English dictionary, but it's just, I to a lot of my clients, like especially the fast growing ones that are really kind of chaotic, I say, you just need a bit more boring in your life. Like you just need to take the stuff that can be boring and make it boring so that you can do the fun stuff, like build your product and go out and sell it. But there's a whole bunch of stuff that you're laboring on here that just needs to be really boring. And governance is one of those boring things that can just make life a lot easier. If you get like just rapid models, racy models, all that kind of thing, like design teams, steering committees, like they sound so fusty and old, but they survived the test of time for a reason.
They really do. And that's something that I've tried to counsel my clients more on, that, and I tell them, look, I can build you a plan, but if you don't have the administration to actually execute on it, then there's no sense in me building a plan. So I'm not going to put a metric in there you can't measure, right? Like, cause I've had that before. I've had clients say, well, it'd be great if we could I was like, well, do you track that?
And then to know the answer, to know the answer, you need that person, like we talked about, on the design team who can immediately answer that question. If they're in the room, then you can save a whole lot of time by not going down a rabbit hole that's going to take you nowhere.
Well, and thankfully there was somebody in the room. It was the person who actually suggested it. Like, well, it was something specific to their industry. And I was like, okay, well, that sounds great. Can you track that? Well, no. Well, then I can't put it in the plan, right? If you can't measure it, I can't put it in the plan. And I would say, that's something I would say with governance models is, as much as I tell people, I don't want to create something you can't use. Well, the governance model makes sure you continue to use it, right? And make sure that you're continuing to do this consistently and fairly, right? And I know those words are thrown out are thrown around quite a bit, but it really, really does matter, especially if you get into a sticky situation. You can say, no. Look, our governance documents, this is what we've done. It's something that is so understated, the importance of it, because it is boring. But I love that. You need more boring in your life. Yeah, it's absolutely right. You do. You need more boring. You need to know who has what responsibilities. You need to know what your calendar of release for the plans is. You need to know how you're going to, like, you need to outline all of this so everyone's on the same page, and then go do the fun stuff, right? Go do the design and all the other stuff. But
Do
yeah,
the work. Like, you're here to do the work,
yeah,
not sit around
yeah,
discussing this stuff. And going back to the finance sales relationship as well.
yeah.
I want to ask about compensation cost of sale.
Okay.
And part of the reason I wanted to ask you about that is because I think a lot of people, maybe from finance, but I don't want to generalize too much. I feel like some of the pushback is looking at a number and saying that's too much, or looking at a possibility
Yeah,
and saying that's too much. But what I like about compensation cost of sale is that you can use it in different scenarios. So I find like one of the barriers with finance is they'll look and say, yeah, but you could earn 2 million here. So, well, yeah, but the question is not how much they're going to earn. The question is how many cents on the dollar are you paying in exchange for the revenue they're
the revenue.
securing,
Yeah,
right? So that's one of the numbers I look at quite a lot when I'm in that financial modeling phase, which requires a certain
sure.
amount of alignment on the plan design. And that's often where decelerators I find come in as well. You might say we can accelerate up to this point, but if we keep accelerating you forever, then it's just going to annihilate our compensation cost of sales. So we need to bring it down a notch above a certain level. Do you use that? And are there any other sort of financial modeling type devices that you use to get it over the line?
I'd say CCOS is probably the most common one that I see specific to sales comp. I do use it, but I use it as a balance to market pricing and to market data. So I had one client that we used it pretty extensively, actually, because they kept saying they thought their sellers are overpaid. And I said, okay, relative to what? Right. And they, eventually like, well, compared to other sellers. I was like, oh, okay. So to like market or something like that. I was like, okay, well, let's take a look. So we took a look at it and I showed them and they're like, wow, some of these people are paid a lot of money. I was like, yeah. I was like, yeah, but you got to remember, market data doesn't have tenure in it. It's general data, right? And I was like, so let me show you what the CCOS looks like. They were right in line, almost dead on with industry average with their CCOS. So the people who are earning big paychecks were bringing in big dollars, and they own the accounts for the industry they're in. They own the accounts. I was like, so if this person walks, studies show they can take about 80% of the revenue with them. So I don't think they're overpaid, if that's the question you want me to answer. I think they're actually paid pretty well in line, and the CCOS helped me prove that, right? And so I recommend people using the CCOS as the internal view and a complement to market pricing, but I also always recommend using it over a period of time, right? Because what people ask me is, well, is this a normal number for this industry, or is this a normal number for, right? And this is the same thing I get for plan designs. They're like, well, is this typical in the industry? And my knee-jerk reaction is, I want to say, it doesn't matter. Is it effective for you? Is it working with your strategy, right? Like benchmarking is not a strategy, right? It's a data point. It should be taken in. It should be helpful, but it should help you, again, getting back to numbers, asking questions. It should help you ask more questions. Well, our CCOS is lower than industry. Okay, so are you going to do something to make it higher? No, of course not. You're going to say, why is it low? Just like the example I'll use for my non-sales comp people is I'll say, okay, if I told you that the national average for turnover was 10%, I think it's somewhere around there, 10 or 13%, and you had a 2% turnover, are you immediately going to go out and fire people so you can be best practice in turnover? Of course not. You're going to say, why do I have 2%? Is that good or bad? I caught a CEO off guard one time. He was saying, oh, we have really low turnover. I was like, yeah. She was like, well, that's fantastic. I was like, well, maybe. And she kind of looked at me and I was like, well, sometimes having more turnover is not a bad thing because you get new talent and you get new ideas and fresh ideas. And I was like,
Yeah.
you could have people kind of just sitting on their hands. I was like, I'm not saying you do, but that's also the possibility of that number. That's why the number itself isn't enough. The number just helps you ask questions, right? So I think the CCOS, I think if it's used in that way, I think that it can be a really helpful really helpful number.
It's a more of an internal thing. It's saying how
It
much we're
is.
willing to spend in exchange for
Yep.
this revenue. But I agree, market benchmark, particularly on the HR side, HR professionals are so used to using market benchmarks to almost define the decisions rather than guide the decisions. But it's even worse with sales. If the market benchmark says, pay this job $400,000, and you look at it and say, well, they're only generating $300,000 of revenue. And what do? You're going to pay them $400,000 and lose money on the dollar? Of course not. Which brings me to a question I get a lot is, what's the right pay mix for a role? So we talked about benchmarking. We often think about in terms of base salary or OTE, on target earnings. But one of the questions that comes up a lot is, how do you define the appropriate pay mix for a given role?
So pay mix. So we first need to find what pay mix is actually getting at. I love to talk about like what the numbers actually mean, because I think so many people want to get stuck on the, oh, well, that's a 70-30 or that's an 80-20. Pay mix is really just talking about how much influence a job has over the sale. So the more aggressive the pay mix, typically, the more aggressive the pay mix, the more influence they have over the sale. That's pretty much what it's supposed to mean. You get more aggressive, the more influence you have over the sale. So you pay for influence, right? The one thing I'll say about pay mix is it can be a bit of a red herring, because the aggressiveness of your pay mix can be affected by the mechanics. So if I have an 80-20, which is not a very, for those listeners, 80-20 means 80% of base, 20% of variable. So a not very aggressive pay mix. And I am paying you $1, right? From the very first dollar you earn, no threshold or anything like that. And then I give you a 60-40 mix, but I set you at an 80% threshold. You actually, if you run the math, you're actually getting paid sooner and more on the 80-20 than you're on the 60-40. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So it's actually technically a more aggressive plan because you're making your money more and stuff like that. So I tell people, like, certainly we can talk about pay mixes and we can talk about what we think is appropriate, but just remember that some of the influence can be shaped by what we do later. And so I usually try really hard to get people settled on preliminary mix and just say, let's just start with this, because this is what I've seen, right? So typically you're going to see the more aggressive pay mixes being anywhere from a 40-60 to a 60-40. The ones that are less aggressive, 70-30, 80-20, right? Like, I don't really see anything above an 85-15. Right? Like, I don't see a whole lot of 100% commission plans anymore, which I think is partially generational, maybe. But I tell people, because it is something, you're right, it is something I think people can get hung up on. It's one of the things that I think it's easy to understand. And a lot of people want to grab onto it and go, wait a minute, is that what we should be doing? Right. And I usually try to get people, they want me to benchmark the pay mix. I'm like, well, okay, I can tell you, I know this kind of role. This is what you'd expect a pay mix to be, but I'm happy to pull some benchmarks, take a look and stuff like that for you. But this is why you're paying that mix, right? That's the important part. This is what this is the message you're telling the seller with this type of mix, right? And so I think just having those conversations, getting something at least preliminarily down, and then moving forward and being able to get to the modeling and saying, okay, here's what the payout looks like. And if they still want to adjust the mix after that, they can. But really, I try to push them past that, because that can be a real sticking point sometimes with organizations.
You mentioned the potential of a first dollar to influence that and things like that. The other side is the upside portion of that pay mix as well. So the more aggressive that pay mix goes, the more you have to offer people in upside. Like, it's no giving someone a 50-50 pay mix and then capping their payout at 1.5x, right? So and again, we see it so much, talked a bit earlier about how plans tend to be designed with all the downside, high thresholds or difficult linkages and that kind of thing, and then nowhere near enough upside to compensate for that risk that you're asking people to take on.
I still don't understand the thresholds on high growth organizations. Like, I want to tell people, don't you want them to grab as much as they can? Like, don't put a threshold on them, right? Let them earn as soon as they start bringing you stuff. So they try to bring you as much as they can, because if they don't think they can hit the threshold, they're not going to try to, or they're going to try to game it. They're going to try to push it to the next payout period and sandbag it or whatever. Just pay them. Especially if you're a high growth or you're trying to be a high growth organization, just pay them. Like, thresholds really don't make sense in that.
I'm very anti-thresholds. I think they come from a place of fear of having low performers, in which case I think you've got way more problems than paying people. They also add a whole lot of complexity, so you can't have a commission plan with a threshold. It doesn't really work. You can, but it doesn't really work very well. So it means you're into all of these sort of bonus type mechanics where it's, if you earn 80%, I'll pay you 60%, all that kind of thing. And if you're into all those bonus mechanics and you've got thresholds, then you get into that horrible world of cumulative year-to-date reconciliations and annual versus quarterly payouts. The minute you mention the word threshold, you're adding a whole load of complexity, and all of that complexity is aimed at low performers. And I just want to say to people, if you've got a low performer, you've got so many bigger issues. And the biggest issue is that you've got a whole territory with someone that you don't think's good enough to sell into that territory. That it doesn't matter whether you're paying them or not. All that lost revenue that you're leaving on the table by not having someone that's qualified and capable to run that territory. So I'm heavily anti-thresholds at this point.
It's sometimes, and I've seen it before, sometimes it's a concession sales makes to make finance feel
right. Yeah.
about the number. Right. And I get it. It's used as a bargaining chip sometimes. I don't really agree with it, but I get it. It's just the situation sometimes. Yeah.
What else comes up? So I've asked you a whole bunch of questions. There is more, by the way. I could keep asking you specifics, but what else do you think really comes up a lot, that Groundhog Day problem that just recurs all the time? Is there anything else that comes up?
Probably the biggest thing that comes up is plan complexity. Usually you have people who want to track everything, and they all want to put it in the incentive plan. And I've told people before, I just had a conversation with someone about MBOs, and they want to put MBOs on people to put information in the system. And I said, I really, really don't recommend that. And they're like, wait, it makes perfect sense. I was like, okay, so what's going to happen is it's not going to be a revenue generating activity. And they're going to wind up putting like one word in for your entries. You're not going to get the data you want, and you're going to pay twice as much as you did before. I was like, that's what's going to happen, or it's likely it'll happen. Right. And so I really like, so there are 3 principles I walk people through whenever they meet me: simple, aligned, and motivating. Plan's got to be those 3 things. Otherwise, they're not going to succeed. And that simple piece is really, really important. The seller has to know in 30 seconds how they make money. So, because what you don't want to do is you don't want them to do what we call shadow accounting, where they're trying to figure out the deals they need to make to hit the money they need to make and all that other stuff. Make it simple. Make it clean. Here's what we need you to go do that, and let them just focus on selling. Don't have them worry about trying to figure out how to make the most money out of their plan. Make it obvious. You know where the holes are in the plan. And if you don't, ask, right? And then monitor those holes, because every plan has holes. Every plan is gameable. Like there is no, that's another question I get a lot is actually, okay, we want to plan, but you got to make sure it's not gameable. Like that's not realistic. So I think that's something like plan simplicity. If you can get your plan down 2 metrics, 3 at the most.
Agreed.
I mean, you can go to tiered commissions. Usually I'll suggest tiered commissions if you can't get to actual like a bonus structure, because that's usually kind of like a halfway house between commissions and bonus in quota plans. So if you can get your plans nice and simple, you're already winning half the battle. I mean, that's really one of the biggest things, because I'll get plans and they'll have 7 metrics in them, and the seller has no idea what you want he or she to do, because you've given them 7 different things that are important, right? Well, we put different weights on them. Yeah, 5% on something isn't going to move a needle, right? So you've got to, that's usually one of the first things I'll talk to clients about is trying to just keep it simple, and just keep it direct, and remember that you're dealing with people, right? Conversation's about motivation, dealing with people. What's going to motivate them? It's not seeing 50 different metrics that they got to hit each one. It's not a scorecard, right? It's an incentive plan. So I think the other thing we need to remember when we're doing this is not everything goes into incentive plan. Some of it goes into sales management. Some of it goes into performance management. It doesn't all need to be an incentive plan. Because if you're expecting the incentive plan to be a replacement for sales management, you're going to have some big challenges.
Yeah, it's so true, especially the MBO one. It drives me nuts. First of all, the terminology irritates me, because MBO stands for management by objectives. So that was coined by Peter Drucker in 1957. It's not what they really mean is an objective, a qualitative objective in the plan. And it's this whole attitude that, again, come back to cognitive closure, but I think it was Ari Koglansky that coined that term, if I remember correctly. It's like, well, if we don't measure it, then they might not do it. It's like this assumption that if you're not measuring, then people aren't going to do things. And if it goes against all the research, so you mentioned 5, 6, 7 metrics, We've known for years, like goal setting theory by Locke and Latham has measured this for years, that if you give people more than 3 to 5 objectives, they will lose interest. And the research on what you can and can't do with incentives, yes, you can drive quantity, but you cannot drive quality with incentives. To your point, if you say enter your information into Salesforce or CRM, they will technically check that
They'll
box
check the
to
box.
earn their
Yep.
incentive because you've
Yep.
given them a reason to do it. But what you don't really want that. What you want is quality data that you can use for forecasting. So this over assumption on what you can do with incentives just keeps coming back in. And I say exactly the same thing as you. You can't fix everything with incentives. You just cannot. So stop trying. Focus on one simple thing, maybe 2 simple things, absolute maximum 3.
Do you want to talk real quickly about your book?
Yeah, if you're going to insist on talking
I'm
about
going
my
to
book,
insist.
then
I
I
insist.
will let you.
I insist. All right. So let me kind of turn the tables a little bit, James. I want to ask you. So, I read this really good book and I want to know what you think about it. It's called, What Pay Costs. For those of you who don't know, that's a book that James wrote. First of all, I was jealous at first because it's the book I wanted to write, because it deals with human behavior and incentives and all that cool stuff. And so I really wanted to know, like, why did you write something like this? Because your book before this is, I'll say, a pretty standard, like it's a nice reference sales combo. It outlines your roles. I still got it on my shelf behind me. I still use it for reference myself. But this one is much more of a narrative. It has much more of an argument to it as to what incentives actually can and can't do. And so, like, I was just curious, where did this idea come from?
Well, I think it's mostly personal experience. I grew up in accounting when I started out, which is a very extrinsically engineered environment where you're measuring your time, you're coding what you're doing down to the activity level. You're measured by 6-minute increments and recording your time to clients. And I hated it. It left absolutely no room for creativity or thinking outside the box. Right? There literally just wasn't any time because you had an hourly target per week. But I've also worked in environments where it was none of that. And I know which one I respond better to. I love having the freedom to try and figure things out. And so another frustration for me, and we mentioned this earlier, is I hate the assumption that people are lazy because they're just not. You just look around you, look at what people do in their free time. No one sits around not doing anything. They're playing games, they're training for runs and training to cycle and training for triathlons, or they're studying history, or they're building things, or learning new hobbies, learning a language. We aren't lazy as a species. We never have been. Though we wouldn't be here if we were a lazy species. So my point is that we find ways in the workplace to engineer laziness. And much of the way we do that is by just treating people like children. We say, well, these are the things you have to do, and we're going to measure whether you do or don't do these things. And if you don't, you're a failure. If you do, you're a success. And so that's the mindset. And I started the book and I was like, okay, the actual start of the book was really, does pay for performance work? I almost used that in the title, Can You Pay for Performance? Because I've always felt that there's so much overemphasis on the capabilities of pay for performance. Yes, you can do it in degrees with the sales team, but for most people, we are complex knowledge workers trying to collaborate and think abstractly. And really what you want from people is innovation. That's the real thing that we want from most people. Organizational survival depends on innovation. There are so many companies that were tracking metrics and activity. And if you assess their ability to do pay for performance, you say you're doing great. You'd say Nokia was doing a great job of pay for performance until iPhone came along. There's so many examples of industries. You say Kodak was doing a great job with the film photography market until they literally ignored their own invention of a digital camera, and Japanese camera makers came along and invented something which was just better and cheaper.
Market. Yep.
Yeah, exactly. You say if you did pay for performance and you just kept measuring the volume and the ability of people to keep doing what they're already doing, everything looks totally fine until it doesn't. And innovation is the thing that stops that happening. So that's really the start point. There's just over-reliance, particularly in Western culture, on what you can and can't measure. And there's this wonderful quote that, again, talk about being jealous of things. I wish I came up with this quote myself. There's a psychologist called William Bruce Cameron who's just amazing, and he wrote a wonderful book years ago about how to study things and how to use data and what is and isn't useful around that. And he said, not everything that counts can be counted, and not everything that can be counted counts. And if you really dig into that, there's so much application. Like the most valuable things, innovations, cannot really be targeted or measured. That you don't know until you have hindsight that something was useful or valuable. I love reading research studies. I find it fascinating, and so many of the answers to our questions are out there. they're just not particularly easy to find or read through to get to those answers. So I wanted to do the research, but I also wanted to combine stories. So I went out and looked for stories of companies that subscribed to this model and then failed, like the ones you've mentioned. You mentioned Wells Fargo earlier as a great example of a company that went very, very aggressively down the pay for performance route and achieved exactly what they wanted to do, but also messed everything up in the process.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
so that was really it. I wanted to try and find a place for these stories and also the research that explains why the stories happened. So the research supports why people did what they did in these stories. And it was as much for just personal curiosity. And honestly, the amount of research and stories that I didn't include just because I felt I was belaboring the point too much. It was kind of a shame. Like I came across all these wonderful stories, but they weren't well documented enough, or they were just one story too many that I couldn't include in the book. So that's really where it came from. So it was hugely interesting to research and read lots of other books in the process.
Well, and for those of you out there, it's incredibly easy to read. It's broken into, so there are a lot of, like you mentioned with some of the stories, there are a lot of familiar stories, but what it has with it is has James' spin on it. He builds an argument early on, and then he takes his stories, and then you kind of see, I'm not going to spoil it, you kind of see his argument in those stories now, the way he presents them. So, and it's also broken into very bite-sized pieces, right? So if you just want to pick it up for a few minutes and then put it back down, it's very, very easy to read. So anyone who's listened, highly recommend What Pay Costs. Excellent book, very quick read. And also something I think, if you're in any way interested in human capital, human behavior, incentive structures, it's a wonderful read. So it's fantastic. I can't recommend it enough.
Thanks, James. I do appreciate the plug, and I want to return the plug and say that if you are listening and you are curious about sales compensation, or you're looking for a sales compensation practitioner, don't hire me, just hire James King of Mercer instead. He'll do a far better job. James, thanks so much for your time. There's also a lot we could have gotten into that we didn't get into, so we're going to have to do another session at some point.
Absolutely.
Maybe get into some really, really specific roles and mechanics and things like that. But I think that's enough for today, as we managed to get through nearly an hour and a half of chit-chat about sales compensation. So finally, thanks so much for your time. People can find you on LinkedIn as well if they need to. I look forward to chatting soon.
Thank you so much, James. I'll see you.
Take care. See you.